what are the key issues you see around the projects you work on around carbon in buildings? Is it purely an aging building stock aspect, or is it more about how we're designing and building new projects? And um, yeah, what are is it also around the sort of the governance aspect in terms of how we have to report on things? Or yeah, what, quite an
Yeah,
open question, I think, a big one, but
yeah. And from the
yeah,
outset,
yeah,
I am not a carbon expert. I'm not a
no,
BIM specialist. So I look on from the point of view as someone who's been involved in a development project, perhaps around the public health community space side, certainly around the ecology and landscape design side. And so we get involved in carbon discussions around carbon measurement. The focus generally, from my perspective anyway, tends to be on the efficient operation of the individual business unit. So how it things like its insulation, things like its renew. Is there any renewables plugged into it? So the kind of basics. I'm working on a retrofit project recently. It really brought home to me people who know far, far more than I do. Just these very basic things about the proper balance between insulation and ventilation in buildings,
mm,
draft
yeah,
exclusion, very simple opportunities for retrofit renewables if they're not already on the site are just a bit like we're talking about with the Swift boxes and the SWAT. They're just fundamental. They're just absolute basics around efficient energy management of buildings, and therefore it's a carbon discussion. That these kind of really essential things should be just part of the way that we think about building design from the outset. I think increasingly that is the case, of course. So in terms of building technology, again, from the point of view of a layman entirely, it seems to be becoming more and more sophisticated. One of the interesting things about that, I think, particularly in industrial settings, in those kind of communal managed settings where you have a set of tenant businesses, or you have an investment property, might be a, let's say, for example, a shopping centre. We work with investment managers quite a bit. Is at that point where you have a an a resource management facility around data collection. The carbon is only one part of that, energy and water, waste, all of these ultimately have a carbon function, of course, is the sharing of that data. So I think this is something that we can do much better on, is the way that the data collection from individual properties, from installations within those properties, collectively aggregated around an estate, that data is shared with the tenant community or with the community of whoever it is who's using that site. The more that we can actually say, well, this building is performing at this level in terms of its overall carbon management, um, that's above or below what we expected, then you're beginning again to open a conversation, just as we talked about with wildlife, where we can say, well, I've got some ideas about that. I've got some things I think I could contribute to this. Let's test them out and let's see what happens. So metrics and data collection can be fantastically valuable once they become a commons. If we share, we're far too tight with that kind of data. Sometimes that data is collected and never seen again. It's just collected for no apparent purpose. But if we can collect
mm,
building performance, development performance data around carbon, energy, water, waste, around this sort of collective sustainability kind of bundle, and find ways of sharing it with that community of residents or businesses, then we're going to again find that there will be great ideas, shared projects, things will move on, new ideas will emerge. But I think we have to be more engaging. It's a technocratic business because it's a complex area that I don't pretend to fully understand at all. And
yeah,
that has to be recognized. This isn't just a free for all. But once that data has been, the capture of the relevant data has been designed, then it should become a commons. That should be in a repository where I know I can find it and it's presented to me in a way that I can understand. And I think that's possible. I think it's possible on any development to have that visible. So the performance of your building in terms of perhaps even boiled down entirely in terms of carbon. So I think building
interesting.
performance, data collection, data sharing is one whole thing that could be fascinating to improve. And some places are doing this. My colleague Nigel and I went to Gibraltar recently to talk with the
Oh yeah,
government of Gibraltar. We're hosting a big meeting, and this was is a fascinating place where land is at such a premium. It's extraordinary. So the built environment is very condensed, very concentrated, and they're beginning to talk about um, sophisticated building design and the sharing of the data that comes from that in such a way that we can learn. The next iteration gets better, the next iteration gets better. Retrofit solutions emerge within those communities. So there's a whole bunch of stuff around that, I think, Matt, that would be helpful for us to explore.
Yeah, I suppose something I saw you discuss um, was around not we're sort of potentially collecting the wrong metrics. I can't remember if it was around ESG or something else. But in terms of the biodiversity aspect and the well-being aspect with buildings, what are you seeing that are the metrics perhaps we're focusing on in the wrong way, or that the metrics we're not even looking at all that would make a big difference to those? Do you think?
I think it's more that they're siloed. I think the the data we collect, particularly the way that sustainability indicators and metrics are set out, whether that's whatever performance metric you're working with, whether this is your ESG returns or other forms of return to an accrediting body or a compliance organization, they are inevitably siloed. So you will have waste, you will have water, you will have energy, different forms of energy. You may have public, almost, I've never seen a human health one in any of those
Yeah,
categories. Hard one to deal with, but it should be there. BNG, or the assessment of ongoing cumulative gains around biodiversity units, may well be in there, or at least the BREEAM data will probably be in there, but they will all be siloed and treated separately. So one of the big issues, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is, and again, this is something that a conventional development and construction program finds very difficult to do, because it is in sense, it's an additional task, is to aggregate all of those metrics, is to pull them all together in a more qualitative, warm data kind of fashion. So that I am very deliberately asking myself questions about waste management and biodiversity at the same time. Well, how can they possibly connect? Well, they are connected. So if
mm,
I'm going to build a communal food composting site, I'm going to do it in such a way that it's actually become a superb habitat, well, for a whole bunch of urban wildlife. So straight away, I've claimed 2 credits for one installation. In the same way we talked about in the case of build, that I'm going to retain as much material on site as I possibly can. I'm going to wipe out all of that carbon expenditure on those unnecessary journeys and fuel points. I'm going to keep it all there, but I'm going to create a space that's better for people and better for wildlife. Well, that's a whole bunch of metrics in one simple design. The reintegrating um, metrics into a combined approach to project design is something that I think we need to do. We're encouraged more and more to separate them out. And you work on a team and a development team, there will be a separate consultant for every single one of those metrics without any doubt at all. And we
yeah,
might
yeah,
talk to one another, but we might not talk to one another. So the way that these development projects are managed needs this idea of deliberately asking these provocative questions. They're kind of, it's a sort of thing that if you're interested in creative thinking, the sort of Edward de Bono kind of stuff. These are the sort of exercises you used to do. Take two seemingly unrelated objects, stick them together, and look for something interesting that comes from that. And that's what we should be doing in metrics, taking that water, that attenuation or water supply metric, and sticking it alongside this human well-being and this carbon and this biodiversity metric, and crunching them together and saying, well, how can I get multiple benefits with one single action? What am I doing wrong? Why have I? It's very inefficient in space because development tends to follow metric in such a way that you have a space allocated for water, a space allocated for waste, a space allocated for energy, a space allocated for biodiversity, and a space allocated for people in general outdoors. Well, that tends to create sprawl, and sprawl is endemic in the UK because we've got plenty of space. UK is what, I don't know, 80% rural still. The Isle of Wight where I work here is 90% rural. Even though we kind of
mm,
constantly have conversations about concreting over the countryside, it's just nonsense. It's just ludicrous because it's never going to happen. Partly because of the existing pattern of environmental designations and landscape designations. So consequently, sprawl is really easy. It's really easy to creep out, and metrics drive sprawl. So we need to pull this back in. Like we were saying earlier, make smaller gardens, create bigger
yeah,
public spaces, but make those public spaces incredibly lumpy and interesting and strange and unusual, provocative and fascinating, rather than just having acres of dead flat, which is the least efficient use of
mm,
space. Obviously, it's just a flat surface. So let's make taller buildings as well. Why are all our buildings so small? I do not understand it. We keep making tiny buildings. So I think weirdly,
yeah,
bringing metrics together around ultimately a carbon conversation, because an efficient ecological system is carbon beneficial because of the way that it cycles nutrients and so on. There's all sorts of benefits around it. So let's call it a carbon conversation if that helps. Crunch the metrics together and deploy them in the way that we design and manage the places that we are building in such a way that we remove this tendency to sprawl. We bring
Yeah.
people and things much closer together, a much closer proximity, and generate a much more active, healthy, interesting, and fulfilling place to live or work.
It's interesting. I'm now sat here thinking of it's a mini film, I suppose, or documentary on Netflix called the Biggest Little Farm. I don't know if you've seen that. Um, it was really lovely. It's basically how everything feeds into each other, and when you talked about all the metrics being looked at together and how they interrelate and so on. Basically, on this farm, they wanted to create I think it was 200 acres. They had a lot of investment to put into it, but they didn't want to be a farm that was we just grow one type of apple and sell that. They grow 70 types of plums and all these different things, and apples, and they had the sheep and the pigs and the chickens and all this type of stuff. And it was all designed to sort of sustain itself, so I don't know, they had too many snails in the orchards. The ducks went and ate that. The droppings from that then fertilized the ground, and that in turn supported something else. And it took them a while to get that balance. It was, I think, 3 years at least before the balance started to flow nicely, and then 7 years overall where everything really had its natural rhythm again.
Yeah.
And it just looked amazing. It looked really healthy, and I think it ties in with what you've been saying about building these better environments for biodiversity, for well-being, and how it all starts to prosper very nicely once you foster that
Yeah.
environment and support it.
Yes, exactly. And there are lots of interesting parallels with forest gardening, with permaculture, all sorts of very interesting
Mm.
parallels, and we can learn from these ideas in the way that we build urban landscaping, just as you were saying, by very deliberately filling all the niches. When we do urban landscaping, it's very, we tend to either just do canopy, so we just plant trees or sticks that will just come up with nothing underneath, or we just do the understory, which is just the kind of shrub layer, or we just do the herbaceous layer. Instead, we
Mm.
should be doing all of those. We should be combining all of them. But that will take 3 or 4 years to shuffle about until it's found that it's balanced. And after that, it pretty much looks after itself. So absolutely, this idea of a very concentrated and very intentional design to pull metrics in real life close together in very close proximity to deliver cumulative gains is absolutely how we should be approaching the built environment, places where we live and work. It's very efficient. It releases space for other things. Suddenly, the development has actually got 30% extra to play with. Well, what do we do with that? Maybe we do nothing with it. Maybe there's an interesting collaboration with a civic partner around this use of space. Who knows? Maybe it's set aside for BNG offsets from somewhere else, something I have major problems with, but let's just say, and then suddenly it's a source of income. So there's all sorts of
Mm.
interesting ways when we think about space efficiency, and space efficiency is carbon efficiency as well, of course. So it is pulling things together, concentrating impacts, heterogeneity over homogeneity, and a tight design approach to even the smallest spaces. That's the key to this stuff.
Nice. Thank you for coming on today, and I found it really interesting. Like going through everything. There's a lot more I think we could talk about for hours. I'd love to, but no, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And if anyone wants to get in touch to learn more about what you do and how they can potentially work with you on different projects they're on, how do they get in touch?
So they can get in touch with me directly on email, and my email is ian@arc-consulting.co.uk. Have a look at the ARC Biodiversity and Climate website. You'll find all our contacts there. Have a look at the Arcology site as well, and you'll find us there. Our numbers are up there as well. So you'll track us down anyway. If you put in ARC Isle of Wight, you'll find us. Don't worry. And we're always very happy to talk to anyone about this kind of stuff, finding new and interesting ways. And of course, we always learn from the folks that we work with. We always come away having to do a better job next time.
Awesome. Lovely. Thank you very much for coming on.
Okay, thank you, Matt. No problem.